In the dying months of World War II, the skies over Europe were no longer ruled by certainty. The Luftwaffe, once feared as the most powerful air force in the world, was crumbling. But in 1944, it still held one last advantage: secrecy. Its fighter squadrons moved constantly, its bases hidden deep behind German lines, camouflaged under forests, barns, and ruins. The Allies needed to find them. Every hidden base, every airstrip, every hangar, because without that knowledge, the invasion of Europe could turn into a massacre. The task fell to intelligence officers who were running out of ideas until someone proposed the impossible. If reconnaissance couldn't find the Luftwaffe, then someone would have to go behind enemy lines, not on foot, not in disguise on the ground, but in the air. Someone would have to fly a German fighter plane straight into Nazi-controlled territory and bring back the truth. It was a mission so daring, so reckless, that it bordered on madness. But one man volunteered. His name was Flight Lieutenant James Albright, a Canadian-born RAF pilot known for his fearlessness and his ability to blend in wherever he went. He spoke fluent German. He understood their slang, their humor, their procedures. He had escaped from a German prison camp once before, and his knowledge of the enemy was intimate, instinctive, and invaluable. When British intelligence approached him with the plan, he didn't hesitate. He knew what it meant. If he succeeded, the Allies would gain a priceless advantage. If he failed, he would die alone, branded as a traitor by both sides. And yet, his answer was simple. He would fly.
The aircraft was a captured Messerschmitt Bf 109, one of Germany's most iconic fighters. It had crashed nearly intact on English soil after a dogfight over the Channel. Now, engineers at a secret airfield restored it, repainted it in authentic Luftwaffe colors, and gave it the markings of Jagdgeschwader 52, one of the most elite German fighter wings. Inside its frame, intelligence officers hid a miniature camera, a coded radio transmitter, and a vial of poison, a silent reminder that capture was not an option. The mission briefing was short and brutal. Fly across the Channel in the stolen Messerschmitt. Blend into enemy air formations. Photograph their airfields. Transcend enemy lines. And somehow find a way back. On the morning of April 19, 1944, under a pale dawn sky, Albright climbed into the cockpit of his German-marked fighter. Every man on the airstrip knew what he was attempting. As the engine roared to life, a strange silence spread through the base, the kind that falls when courage and fear meet in the same breath. Moments later, the Messerschmitt lifted off and disappeared into the mist, its black cross markings glinting faintly in the morning light. Across the Channel, German radar detected an approaching aircraft, a friendly return signal, they thought. Soon, two Focke-Wulf 190s moved to intercept, but Albright didn't flee. He didn't fight. He simply joined formation, saluting the other pilots as though he belonged among them. To their eyes, he was one of their own. To him, every second was a gamble with death.
He flew with them for an hour, maintaining perfect formation, mimicking every maneuver. When they finally descended toward an airfield in Belgium, Albright followed them down. On the ground, mechanics and officers swarmed the returning planes, shouting orders and greetings. And in that chaos, Albright simply blended in, parking his plane, shutting down the engine, and walking among the enemy as though he'd always been there. For the next 48 hours, the airfield became his prison and his opportunity. He lived among German pilots, ate their rations, and listened to their conversations. Every night, he slipped away under cover of darkness, photographing aircraft lined along the runways, fuel depots, and radar stations. He memorized flight rosters, insignia, and new aircraft designs that hinted at desperate German experiments, including jet prototypes few outside the Reich had ever seen. Each night, using the small transmitter hidden in his flight suit, he sent bursts of coded information back to England. Every message was a piece of a larger picture, one that would soon allow Allied planners to pinpoint Luftwaffe positions with terrifying accuracy. But the longer he stayed, the greater the risk became. By the third day, whispers spread across the base. Someone had seen an unfamiliar face. Someone had heard a strange accent, and the word spy began to circulate. That night, headlights appeared at the edge of the airfield, Gestapo vehicles. They had come for a man named Kruger, the false identity Albright had been using. He knew his time was up.
He sprinted to his Messerschmitt as floodlights cut across the tarmac. Bullets tore through the hangar walls as engines screamed to life. The plane shot forward into the night, rising just above the treetops, tracer rounds slicing the air behind him. German flak batteries opened fire, their shells bursting like fireflowers in the sky. For hours, Albright flew alone through darkness, hugging the ground, dodging radar. He had no maps, no escort, and barely enough fuel to cross the channel. Twice, Luftwaffe fighters spotted him, but he deceived them with confident radio chatter in flawless German, impersonating an officer giving patrol orders. It worked. They let him pass. By dawn, the coastline appeared, the white cliffs of Dover glowing faintly in the early sun. But the British radar didn't know who he was. To them, he was an inbound enemy aircraft. Spitfire scrambled to intercept. Albright had been briefed for this moment. He rocked his wings, the prearranged signal of recognition. The British pilots held their fire, and moments later, the German-marked Messerschmitt landed safely on British soil, its pilot alive but exhausted, his mission complete. The photographs he carried and the intelligence he transmitted would later prove invaluable. They revealed the hidden locations of Luftwaffe bases, aircraft reserves, and refueling depots across Western Europe. Within weeks, Allied bombers struck these targets with surgical precision, crippling Germany's air defenses just as D-Day approached. Historians later agreed, without that intelligence, the skies over Normandy could have been a massacre. Instead, the Luftwaffe never arrived in strength. They were already broken, deceived by one of their own planes, flown by a man who never should have been there. James Albright's mission was buried in secrecy for decades. His name disappeared from records, his service file marked classified. Some say he was sent on other covert flights, deep into occupied territory. Others believe he was shot down later in the war, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in France. But his story, passed quietly among the few who knew, lived on as legend. He was the pilot who fooled the Luftwaffe, the man who crossed enemy skies wearing their wings, who turned deception into survival and courage into strategy. In war, victory often belongs not to the strongest or the fastest, but to those who can think like the enemy, move like the enemy, and become the enemy long enough to bring them down.
When Albright's Messerschmitt roared back over the channel, few on the ground understood what had just been accomplished. It was more than a flight. It was a calculated act of deception that cut to the very core of Germany's air command. But in Berlin, the repercussions were immediate. To the Luftwaffe, the idea that one of their own planes had been used against them was unthinkable and intolerable. The German high command began an internal purge. Pilots were interrogated, airbase officers replaced, and suspicion seeped into every squadron. Commanders demanded to know who had flown the mysterious Bf-109 that disappeared and never returned. For the first time, the Luftwaffe began to fear not just Allied bombs, but betrayal from within. Albright's photographs were analyzed by British intelligence within hours of his landing. The images revealed extraordinary details: rows of aircraft hidden under camouflage nets, fuel depots buried beneath farmhouses, radar towers disguised as barns. Even more startling was a set of pictures showing sleek, narrow-bodied planes parked in secrecy near Augsburg, jet aircraft. The British analysts couldn't believe their eyes. The Germans were testing the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was faster than anything the Allies had. If deployed in numbers, it could have changed the course of the war. But Albright's photos showed that only a handful were operational and that they were vulnerable. That intelligence would later help guide Allied strikes on the jet facilities before the Me-262 could enter full combat service. In a single flight, Albright had given the Allies not just positions, but foresight. He had shown them what was coming next.
The mission's echo. Over the following weeks, Allied bombers unleashed a coordinated campaign. The targets, the very same airfields Albright had photographed. Each one went up in flames, the Luftwaffe's remaining strength shredded before it could regroup. The German fighter network across France began to collapse. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was nearly blind. Its squadrons were grounded or scattered. Few German planes even reached the beaches. For every bomber that fell over Normandy, dozens more reached their targets unhindered. Albright's intelligence had done its silent work. But while the Allied High Command celebrated, Albright himself was not there to join them. He was already being briefed for another mission, one even deeper into occupied Europe. This time, he was to locate fuel convoys and underground depots supporting the Luftwaffe's dwindling reserves. And again, he would go in disguise. But this time, the risk would be greater, because the Germans were already hunting for him. The hunter becomes the hunted. In the summer of 1944, Albright took off once more, this time from a hidden base in southern England. His plane was another restored Messerschmitt, painted with the insignia of a different German unit. He crossed the channel under heavy cloud cover, slipped into occupied France, and followed the Meuse River toward the heart of Germany. But this time, the Gestapo was waiting. Intercepted radio messages, recovered fragments of Allied code, and witness reports had drawn a pattern. A ghost pilot flying in Luftwaffe colors, photographing airfields, and vanishing into the night. They called him the Schattenflieger, the shadow pilot. To catch him, the Luftwaffe set traps, squadrons flying false patrol routes, radio stations sending decoy signals, and ground units ordered to detain any pilot without perfect identification. The skies themselves had turned hostile not from the enemy's guns, but from their suspicions. For 2 days, Albright evaded patrols, flying low through fog, snapping photos as he went. He transmitted coded messages at night, using brief bursts to avoid detection. Each flight brought him closer to the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley. But near Dusseldorf, his luck began to unravel. A Luftwaffe patrol intercepted him as he descended for reconnaissance. When challenged over the radio, he responded with a unit code, one that had been valid weeks earlier. It was enough to expose him. The German fighters closed in. Tracer fire streaked across the sky. His plane dove into the clouds, engines screaming, bullets tearing through the wings. He barely escaped, using cloud cover to vanish toward the west. His fuel was nearly gone. He knew he would never make it back across the channel. Somewhere over Belgium, witnesses reported a German-marked fighter gliding silently before vanishing into a wooded valley. No wreckage was ever found. No pilot recovered. For weeks, British intelligence waited, listening for any coded signal, any sign that Albright had survived. None came. The legend of the shadow pilot. When the war ended, a single folder remained in MI6 archives, marked Operation Mirror Wing. Inside were photographs, mission notes, and a single page signed by Albright before his final flight. If I am captured, remember only this. The enemy's uniform is just fabric. The mission is what defines the man. His actions remained classified for decades, hidden behind official secrecy and wartime politics. But among the few who knew, his story became legend, whispered among intelligence officers, studied by future pilots. Because in an age when technology and tactics ruled the battlefield, one man had turned the enemy's greatest symbol, their own aircraft, into a weapon of truth.
The Luftwaffe never knew exactly who had done it. Their records mentioned a phantom pilot, a traitor who infiltrated their ranks. But none of them ever realized the truth. He was never one of theirs to begin with. But hidden behind that day's triumph was another story, one that few would ever know. The quiet shadow of a pilot whose mission months earlier had helped make the invasion possible. Because before the paratroopers dropped, and before the beaches turned red with fire and salt, Allied planners had faced a terrifying question. Where was the Luftwaffe? For weeks, reconnaissance aircraft had returned with conflicting reports. Some said the German fighter bases had been moved inland. Others believed the Luftwaffe was conserving fuel, waiting to strike when the invasion began. But the truth, the real, devastating truth, had already been uncovered by one man flying a stolen Messerschmitt under false colors. James Albright's photographs and radio reports had revealed the secret. The Luftwaffe was broken, dispersed, and blind. Its fuel reserves were dwindling, its radar network fractured, its aircraft scattered across half-abandoned fields and makeshift hangars. And so, when D-Day arrived, the German air response never came. Of the thousands of aircraft that should have risen to meet the invasion, barely a few dozen took off. Most never reached the coast. The Allies controlled the sky. Their bombers moved unhindered, their transports flew unmolested, and the invasion that could have drowned in blood instead carved a path into Fortress Europe. Historians would later argue that it was radar, numbers, or sheer luck that gave the Allies air superiority on that day. But in the archives of British intelligence, the truth was clearer. The destruction of the Luftwaffe's forward bases, the strikes that crippled its fuel, its communications, its ability to move, had all been guided by a single operation, an operation codenamed Mirror Wing.
The web of secrecy. After D-Day, the documents from Operation Mirror Wing were sealed away in a locked vault beneath the War Office in London. The photographs were labeled unverified, the radio logs erased from official records. To the outside world, the mission never existed. No one spoke of the pilot who had flown in enemy colors, who had crossed the channel alone, who had returned with intelligence that reshaped the war. Only a few officers knew. They were men bound by silence, intelligence directors, flight commanders, cryptographers. They referred to Albright not by name, but by code name, Ghost Falcon. For months after his disappearance, MI6 continued to intercept fragments of German radio chatter mentioning him. References to a rogue Luftwaffe officer, a traitor in uniform, a pilot who vanished into the West. Even the Gestapo's internal memos hinted at their confusion. They had searched every squadron, interrogated hundreds, and found nothing. They had been hunting a man who had never truly belonged to them. The irony was bitter. Germany's once fearsome air force had been undone by the very image of itself, by the illusion of its own power reflected back through the deception of one man. The dossiers and the denials. When the war finally ended, Allied intelligence began the slow, methodical process of declassification. But some stories were deemed too dangerous, too unconventional, to ever be made public. Flying under enemy insignia was a direct violation of international law. If captured, Albright would not have been treated as a soldier, but as a spy, tortured, executed, forgotten.
The British government, fearing diplomatic backlash and public controversy, quietly erased the mission from official archives. His records were sealed under the 30-Year Secrecy Act. His family received no details, only a simple letter. Flight Lieutenant James Albright is presumed missing, action unknown. To the world, he was another lost airman of the war. But within the hidden corridors of intelligence, his name was whispered as a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and quiet rebellion. The aftermath, the broken sky. Meanwhile, across Germany, the Luftwaffe lay in ruins.
By late 1944, the once proud squadrons that had darkened Europe's skies were reduced to fragments. Fuel was scarce, pilots were inexperienced, runways lay cratered from constant bombardment. Even the mighty Me-262 jets that had once promised salvation now sat grounded, their factories bombed, their parts missing. In the shattered remnants of Air Command, officers pored over reports of the shadow pilot, the mysterious infiltrator who had brought ruin to their bases. Some believed he had been a deserter. Others insisted he was an Allied trick, a fabrication to sow distrust. But none could deny the effect. Paranoia spread through the Luftwaffe like a fever. Commanders no longer trusted their own men. Orders were double-checked, codes changed daily, and accusations of treason became common. In trying to catch one ghost, the Luftwaffe had begun to consume itself. Post-war discoveries. 2 decades later, in 1965, a declassified British intelligence memo resurfaced. It contained a partial transcript from a Luftwaffe officer captured in May 1945. The officer described a mysterious pilot who had landed briefly at a forward base in Belgium, then vanished days before the base was destroyed. His words were clear.
He wore our colors, spoke our tongue, but his eyes were not German. He was the calmest man I ever saw. For historians, that single line became a key. It confirmed that the operation had been real, that someone had indeed flown among the enemy, photographed their strength, and lived long enough to tell the tale. And though the full files of Operation Mirrorwing remain sealed even today, enough fragments have emerged to piece together the truth. The Allied command had sanctioned one of the most daring espionage flights in aviation history, and it had succeeded beyond all expectation. A legacy in silence. There were no parades for James Albright, no medals pinned, no speeches made. His story lived in the margins, a rumor among pilots, a classified line in forgotten dossiers, a myth whispered by those who studied the intelligence war. Yet in every sense, his flight represented the essence of Allied resolve to outthink, outfly, and outlast an enemy that believed itself unbeatable. He had done what no one else dared, turned the enemy's wings into his camouflage, their arrogance into his weapon, and their skies into his battlefield. His courage lived on, not in glory, but in the quiet victories that shaped history, the successful landings at Normandy, the steady march to Paris, the final liberation of Europe. And though the man himself vanished into the fog of war, his shadow remained, drifting forever in the legend of that one impossible flight. He was the ghost who stole the Luftwaffe's sky, the nameless ace who crossed the line between hero and outlaw, the pilot who fooled the Luftwaffe. The ghost returns. The war ended in 1945. The world exhaled. But the ghosts it left behind did not rest. They lived on in the ruins, in the forests, in the wrecks that dotted Europe, silent testaments to courage, fear, and sacrifice. For years, James Albright's name meant nothing to anyone outside a locked cabinet in London. His file lay buried under decades of dust, his photographs fading, his story whispered only by the few who had seen his final transmissions. Then, in 1972, a discovery would bring his legend back to life.
Deep in the Ardennes, Belgian foresters clearing an old wartime logging trail unearthed the twisted remains of a World War II aircraft. The engine had sunk into the earth. Its markings were faint, the black crosses of the Luftwaffe, still visible under rust and moss. Inside the cockpit lay a skeleton, still strapped to the seat, a pistol, a rusted camera, and under the instrument panel, a small corroded metal capsule containing a British cipher pad. It was the wreck of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, but it didn't belong to any German unit ever listed as missing in that region. When British authorities examined the site, they knew at once what they had found. The serial number on the engine matched the one listed in a sealed report from 1944, the same plane stolen for Operation Mirrorwing. The pilot inside had been James Albright. After nearly 30 decades, the ghost who had flown into enemy skies had been found. The truth unearthed. The evidence recovered from the wreck confirmed what intelligence officers had long suspected. The camera still held fragments of unprocessed film, tiny grainy images of an airfield, trucks, and fuel tanks. Even in decay, the shots matched Allied reconnaissance archives from that period. It was proof that Albright had completed his mission before he died. It appeared that on his return flight from Germany, chased by enemy fighters and running low on fuel, he had been forced to descend over Belgium. Somewhere between the clouds and the gunfire, his aircraft clipped the treetops and went down. He died alone, deep in enemy territory, never knowing that his intelligence had already shaped one of the most decisive victories of the war. Forensic teams buried his remains with full military honors under his real name, Flight Lieutenant James Albright, in a small Commonwealth cemetery near Bastogne. There were no family members present, only a handful of officers, old and gray, who had once known his name, not as a man, but as a code name, Ghost Falcon.
The secrecy lifts. With his rediscovery, Britain faced a dilemma. How much could be revealed? Flying under enemy insignia had been forbidden under the rules of war, and even decades later, the government feared controversy. But historians pressed for the truth. And slowly, across the 1980s, fragments of Operation Mirrorwing began to surface. In 1987, an RAF historian named Charles Fenwick published a paper titled "The Pilot Who Flew Both Flags." It contained the first public acknowledgement of the mission, albeit stripped of classified details. The reaction was immediate. Some dismissed it as wartime myth, a romantic fabrication. Others, particularly among veterans, knew better. The photographs existed, the wreck existed, and so did the legend. For those who had served in the skies, Albright became a symbol, not of disobedience, but of devotion. He had gone beyond orders, beyond fear, into a realm few could imagine. His weapon had been deception, his courage, silence.
He fooled us all. But he was a pilot, like us, and he earned the sky. That moment, quiet, fragile, and human, became the final closing of a circle that had begun half a century earlier in fire and deceit. The sky remembers. Today, the story of James Albright is told in hushed tones in flight schools, intelligence circles, and among those who still study the art of deception in warfare. His name is sometimes omitted from textbooks, hidden behind code words and bureaucratic redactions. But every so often, when historians speak of courage that bends